وأكرمنا بمعرفة العلم وزين أخلاقنا بالحلم يا أرحم الراحمين آمين آمين وآخر دعوانا الحمد لله رب العالمين. We pray to Allah Azza wa Jal on this blessed night to record us among His accepted servants, guided servants. We ask Him subhanahu to bless us with a good understanding of our deen and to make us of those who live the meaning of worship in everything they do. In the masjid, in their homes, in their workplaces and schools. May Allah Azza wa Jal give us the understanding and the capacity to continue to grow in our journey to Him in every way possible. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala fill our hearts with His abundant mercy and fill our homes with His abundant mercy and bless us with His love and the love of His Prophet ﷺ and make that a means to our salvation on the Day of Judgment. Allahumma ameen, Allahumma ameen. Amma ba'd, today we have another installment of our topics that we give at the Friday Forum, and we're switching gears a little bit. We spoke about a lot of issues relating to family relationships. Last week it was about parents and children, and the week before that about gender. So inshallah we wanted to switch gears to speak about something relating to the way we handle our money. And I'm going to be giving a framing for this inshallah in a minute, but I guess we want to start off with making a few important announcements about the coming programs in our masjid inshallah. So Says Muhammad, tfaddal, if you could make the announcements.
Assalamu alaikum. So with the announcements that we have, first of all, tomorrow inshallah here at ICPC-Clifton, they're having a program, Muslim in College. What it is, it's a workshop for incoming or returning college students. It's for brothers and sisters over the age of 17. Also, not this coming week, but the following week, there are two classes that will start up here in Clifton. The first of which is on Monday nights, and that's with Shaykh Yasir Fahmi. The name of the class is Hadith Jibreel, and it's a journey through the dimensions of Islam with Shaykh Yasir. It's going to be on Mondays from 7 to 9 p.m. If you'd like to register for that, the registration is through Prophetic Living, so you have to go to their website to register for that. The following day, on the 27th, will be the first class for Shaykh Osamah, which is the Intro to Quranic Interpretation. It's a course explaining the last chapter of the Quran, Juz' Amma. That'll be on Tuesdays at 8 o'clock, and for that it's free registration, and you can register right on ICPC's website. So those are the three upcoming events going on in the masjid. So with tonight's Friday Forum, the topic, this is a part one for Intro to the Ethics of Islamic Finance. Along the same lines, the last few topics, as the Shaykh mentioned, were about family, about gender relations, and you know, I guess the common theme between all these topics is something we touched on last Friday, which was, you know, as far as who we really are, you know, as people and as Muslims, it's you know, it's not just the face that we show when we go to the masjid or when we're at work, we're at school. It's who we really are, you know, when we're with our families. And as well as when no one is watching, and that kind of ties into, you know, what we'll be talking about with regards to Islamic finance. You know, we always, whether you may be a business owner, you may be an employee, an investor, it's important to understand, you know, as far as the Islamic rulings on, you know, how to earn an income as well as how to spend it, and not think of it in a bubble. It's tied into who we are, and it's a major component and a major act of worship. So inshallah we'll be touching upon that.
Jazakallah khair. Jazakallah khair, Akhi Muhammad. Allah barik feek, and it's good to have you for the discussion today. We usually like to keep these Friday forums as discussions so we can keep them interactive. We got the number up as usual. If you have questions, then please text the number, and Muhammad will infuse it into our discussion, inshallah. You know, I want to start off by clarifying a little bit about the title. You know, sometimes when you see Islamic finance, you automatically think it's a discussion about mortgages or about modes of finance and halal and haram and ahkam and all the rest, and that's actually not what it is about at all. It's actually about how I should handle money, How do I handle money? This subject is relevant to everyone who has $1 in their pocket. Everyone who is spending, everyone who's earning, and anyone who's ever in a position where they're in a transaction with another human being. What are the guidelines? What's the guidance of our deen in terms of financial dealing? And there's a lot to say in that regard. But for starters, Akhi Muhammad, one of the scholars of our past was asked, why don't you write a book about tazkiyah and purification of the soul? And he responded, I already did. And he actually wrote a book about al-Kharaj. This was, I believe it was Abu Yusuf or Muhammad ibn Hassan, one of the students of Imam Abu Hanifa, who wrote this book. And the understanding there is very clear, in that purification of the soul, being a spiritual person, being a quote-unquote pious person, isn't by making your prayers extra long, isn't by staying in the masjid day and night, even though those aren't bad things, they're good things. It's not about crying in your prayers, it's not about ritualistic things. No, it's about something a lot more than that, right? Am I someone who is responsible? Am I someone who handles what Allah Azza wa Jal put on my shoulders in a way that is dutiful, sincere, trustworthy? Those are serious questions. That's why there's a quote by one of the scholars of our past. He said, اتق المحارم تكن أعبد الناس. Be very cognizant of the boundaries of Allah Azza wa Jal, and that'll make you the most devout of people. Right? When I'm talking about handling money, how do I perceive the subject of rizq? That's a subject. Allah is Ar-Razzaq. Sometimes people are put in situations where they feel like they have to compromise their values in order to get what they think will be rizq. Sometimes people sacrifice their beliefs to earn an extra buck. Right? That's something to talk about. Sometimes people have a very faulty, Habibi, guys, please if you keep the voice down over there. Jazakumullah khair. Please if someone could keep the children under control. Jazakumullah khair. Sometimes people have a very flawed understanding of what, Jazakallah khair, of what rizq means and what it refers to. Actually, this even happened during the time of Sayyidina Umar. And this is where, we begin to shape a different understanding of what it means to worship Allah. Right? What does it mean? Well, one time he walked in the masjid, and it wasn't the time of prayer, and he found people just sitting in the masjid. So he began shooing them out. Can you imagine this? Like someone as pious as Sayyidina Umar, one of the greatest of companions, sitting there, kicking people out of the masjid. You could never imagine this. But Sayyidina Umar was teaching them a lesson. He was saying to them, none of you should sit down from seeking rizq and say, Allahumma arzuqni, oh Allah give me. That just doesn't make sense. For you to raise your hands to the heavens and say, oh Allah give me, yet you're not making any effort to actually earn. Because this dunya is qa'ima ala asbab. There's a causal relationship between what we do and what we receive in return. So Sayyidina Umar, he said, لا يقعد أحدكم عن طلب الرزق ويقول اللهم ارزقني فقد علمتم أن السماء لا تمطر ذهبا ولا فضة. You know that gold and silver doesn't rain from the sky, even though we wish it did. We wish that there was a money tree in the backyard, and instead of it being green leaves, it was actually dollars. Well, it'd be great, It'd be great for money to come very easily like that. But that's not the way it works, right? So what Sayyidina Umar was doing was shaping our understanding of worship when he said that. Because some people, especially when they get, new to practice, they automatically think what it means to be practicing is, I need to be in the masjid all the time, every time, and I need to avoid everything, absolutely everything that has any shade of gray in it. And of course that's not practical. If you're going to do that, you're not going to function, especially in the world that we live in. That's just not the way it works. There's another example, Akhi Muhammad, and this is all part of the framing, by the way. What I like to try to do in the beginning of these discussions is give a framework for this discussion so that we have a holistic view of what we're trying to achieve here. There's another example from one of our Salaf, is actually Abdullah ibn al-Mubarak. Have any of you guys ever heard of Abdullah ibn al-Mubarak? Raise your hand if you've heard of him. We have a few people that have heard of him. Alright, he has a very famous book. Do you guys know what it's called? Sayyidina Abdullah ibn al-Mubarak. Anyone know his book? He wrote a book called Az-Zuhd. Az-Zuhd means to be an ascetic. And asceticism is something that's often, misunderstood. It's the ascetics actually, even before Islam, there was this concept of monasticism, right? Rahbaniyya. They are people who detach themselves from worldly life and they fixated themselves on the inward. They don't work, they don't do anything, they don't have relationships and stuff like that. They're in their monasteries and they're monks and focused on worship. And of course we know the Prophet ﷺ said, La rahbaniyata fil Islam. But we have this concept of zuhd. Zuhd is a little different than that idea of monasticism, right? Because people think that in order to be someone who's a zahid, an ascetic, means you can't have any worldly attachment, in a literal sense. So, his students observed that he used to bring merchandise from the lands of Khurasan. Khurasan, you guys know where Khurasan is? Where's Khurasan? They're in the lands of Persia, Greater Persia, right? These are the regions around the Oxus River, Bilad Mawara al-Nahr, and the Bilad Faris. These areas, he would bring merchandise from these areas. And his students were surprised, because obviously that's not an easy task. You're bringing it from very far away. The means of travel aren't very easy, and he's actually selling these products and earning a living. And they said to him, you command us to be ascetics, تَأْمُرُنَا بِالزُّهْدِ. And then you go ahead and bring this merchandise from far off lands, and you're buying and you're selling, and we don't get it. We don't get it. So he said to them, he said to this particular student who was asking this, يَا أَبَا عَلِي إِنَّمَا أَفْعَلُ ذَا لِأَصُونَ بِهِ وَجْهِي وَأُكْرِمَ بِهِ عِرْضِي وَأَسْتَعِينَ بِهِ عَلَى طَاعَةِ رَبِّي. He said very important words. He said, I'm doing this so that I may protect my face in a literal sense from needing to ask. لِأَصُونَ بِهِ وَجْهِي, from needing to ask. And then he said, وَأُكْرِمَ بِهِ عِرْضِي, and so that I may honor and I may be generous to my ird and my family and those who are my dependents. And he says, so that I may devote myself better, in a better fashion to Allah Azza wa Jal. There's a lot to unpack here. By the way, brothers and sisters, when we're talking about poverty and its effects on people, that's a big, it's a devastating thing to see. If you really want to see the effects of poverty on people, go look at what's happening to our brothers and sisters in Syria, and what happened before that to our brothers and sisters in Iraq after the Iraq war, and all of the things that came about in terms of begging, in terms of actually finding yourself in such a difficult situation where you need to be exposed to certain things you would have never imagined doing. And I don't want to go in detail in this type of setting here right now, because it's just so sad for us as an ummah that many young girls, many women found themselves in situations that compromised their honor in order to just be able to provide for their families. Many people live poverty, brothers and sisters, and poverty is not an easy thing to deal with. What we take from his words is, debt could have a deep and far-reaching effect on a person's faith. Poverty can also have the same effect. That's why, there's a dua of the Prophet ﷺ that says the following: Allahumma inni a'udhu bika min al-kufri wal-faqr wa a'udhu bika min adhab al-qabr. Oh Allah, I seek refuge in you from kufr and faqr, from disbelief and from poverty. And I seek refuge in you from the fire of hell. Why is that? You might find someone who's impoverished and this poverty brings them back to Allah. They're very patient with their test and it makes them, someone who is in a state of utter submission to Allah Azza wa Jal. But then you'll find other situations where someone's overwhelmed with life and unable to provide, and it causes them to make difficult decisions. That's why the Prophet ﷺ says in another hadith, Al-faqru baridul kufr. That sometimes when someone doesn't have it, really puts their faith to the test. Am I going to stay humbly submitting to Allah Azza wa Jalla, or am I going to make a bad decision to get out of the situation I'm in? Right? So, and there's a lot more to say about that. Inshallah, that could be part of part 2. The effects of poverty on an ummah. The effects of poverty on an ummah, they're really severe. Brothers and sisters, poverty could change people's character. Right? Being overwhelmed by debt could cause immense amounts of stress. And that stress in turn could affect families. Could take away parents from their children. Consumed by work, working 12 hours a day. That's a different discussion. Because sometimes debt is by force, and sometimes debt is by choice. You guys following along with me? As I said in the beginning, we want to try to keep this like a more of a spiritual gathering in the house of Allah Azza wa Jal. So anyone against the wall who doesn't need it, come forward. We want you guys to be close. Any sisters who would like to come towards here, please feel free to come towards the center here, inshallah. But pay attention to this, because sometimes debt is by force and sometimes it's by choice. And what I want us to really reflect on is the way we receive money, the way we spend money, and what we end up doing in our financial dealings with each other. There's a lot to say in terms of what shows the level of iman in that regard. Wallahu a'lam. So that's the framing, and hopefully we'll get into more detail through our discussion. So tfaddal Akhi Muhammad, if you want to add to that, inshallah.
Inshallah. So I think the way I think of the topic to begin, we all think of earning a living just in the basics, which is you go to school to get a degree, to get a job, to earn a living. I think if we can tie earning a living and our financial state into a spiritual realm, at that point we can talk about people having lofty aspirations when it comes to their financial status, and from there we can speak about the decisions one would make, or in terms of earning and also spending. At the very basic level, earning a living and earning an income, to tie that to a spiritual realm. We know from the hadith from the Prophet ﷺ about as far as giving sadaqah, and the most beloved zakah or sadaqah to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being that which you spend on your own family. So if you can just touch on that and the importance of earning a living, then providing for your own family.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Jazakallah khair, Akhi Muhammad. The acts of worship shape our personality, each one in its own particular way. When you pray, it teaches you certain things about life. When you fast, it teaches you other things about life. When you work, it also teaches a person certain things about life, ideas of responsibility and commitment and and duty. And that's why the prophets, may Allah's pleasure be upon them, actually experienced work. Sometimes when you think about the Prophet ﷺ and the companions, you think of this image where they're a group of great people sitting in circles in the masjid and just like living there all the time. But actually that's not the way it worked at all. In fact, the Prophet ﷺ tells us in the hadith, to your point, مَا بَعَثَ اللَّهُ نَبِيًّا إِلَّا رَعَى الْغَنَمِ. Allah never sent a prophet except that he experienced a type of job that's actually very involved. It's not an easy type of work. It's being a shepherd to a flock and making sure that they stay going in the right direction, and that you make sure that they're all nourished, and so on and so forth. They asked the Prophet ﷺ, even you used to be a shepherd? So the Prophet ﷺ said, نعم كنت أرعاها على قراريط من قريش. I used to do that in return for some money I would get from some people from Quraysh. It was a job, right? And there's another hadith that tells us, مَا أَكَلَ أَحَدٌ طَعَامًا خَيْرًا مِمَّا كَسَبَتْ يَدُهُ. There's nothing that you could possibly eat better than your hard-earned money. So in this regard, I think that the meaning is, what could work and labor teach a person about life? That's something for every parent to consider. Because if you don't expose your children to certain responsibilities, then actually that could corrupt character. Work, if done with the right intention and the right direction, could actually build character. And that's exactly what the Prophet ﷺ is teaching us in this type of hadith. You know what? To add to this, the Prophet ﷺ tells us, even if you were to get a bundle of wood and take it to the market and sell that wood, it would be better for you to do that than ask people for money, whether they give you or not. The Prophet ﷺ, through this hadith and a few other hadiths about debt, is teaching us that labor and living within your means is far better than taking on debt and living beyond your means. That's an attitude towards life. Because a lot of what people suffer from today is a culture that promotes debt, right? In fact, it encourages it. In fact, you only could really build yourself up in terms of your credit score and your credit history is if you take on debt. And that could be a very tricky thing, a slippery slope. Right? You gotta, of course they're not going to give you, you know better about this, but you start off with your first credit card. They're going to give you a credit line of 20,000? No, they're not. They're going to give you a little amount, but you start building up, and then all of a sudden you got a credit card with $20,000 credit line. That's really tempting. That's really tempting, and you could keep on using it and end up finding yourself living way beyond what your paycheck actually would warrant. And then what does it end up causing? It causes a whole world of stress and anxiety, and that translates to perhaps distancing yourself from the masjid. And that's why there's a hadith that says, إِنَّ الرَّجُلِ إِذَا غَرِمْ إِسْتَدَانَ فَحَدَّثَ فَكَذَبَ وَوَعَدَ فَأَخْلَفَ. The Prophet ﷺ warns, don't do this in terms of worship, because when you fall into a deep, dark hole of debt, then it'll lead you to take more debt. And that'll hence lead you to end up, it'll corrupt character. It'll cause a person to break their promises. It'll cause a person to speak lies just so that they could continue to, maintain themselves. So that's a little bit about that, about how work redefines worship for us in its own particular way. Wallahu a'lam.
The other misconception that a lot of Muslims have is that the Prophet ﷺ somehow encouraged or romanticized the concept of poverty, in terms of on the Day of Judgment, the Prophet ﷺ, I think this is a misunderstood hadith from the Prophet ﷺ of him, wishing to or saying that the people who are impoverished will be the first people who are judged, and in terms of him making dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that he not die as someone with a lot of wealth. So I think and to some extent I personally feel like some people use that as an excuse as to not go out and try to have lofty aspirations when it does come to earning a living. So as Muslims, what should be our mindset? Is it living comfortably, providing for our family, or just the bare minimum, or going out and having high aspirations, whether it be for your family, for your community, and beyond that?
Well, that's a really good question. Jazakallah khair for asking that. Look, you guys know some companions that were wealthy, right? And you guys can name some. Who was a wealthy companion? Abdurrahman ibn Auf, right? Who else? Do you know some? Uthman, right? There's something special you should know about Uthman that is still with us till today. You guys know what it is? What's special? Uthman has something still going for him until this very day. You want to say what it is, brother in the back? Yes, Bi'r Uthman. If you guys have ever gone to Umrah, have you ever got dates from Bi'r Uthman? You should try to get dates from there. It's actually one of the longest living waqfs in the history of this ummah. From the time of Sayyidina Uthman, large plots of land, constantly producing dates, and these dates are sold and the earnings from it are going to public causes. Right? That's amazing. Sayyidina Uthman is a great example of a Muslim businessman who was at the greatest heights of devotion and servitude to Allah. And actually this hadith about wealthy people entering Jannah later on, after the poor, is something that is misunderstood. The other hadith that you mentioned, just to reiterate, was the hadith that says, Allahumma ahini miskinan wa amitni miskinan wa hshurni fi zumratil masakin. This hadith saying, oh Allah, let me live among the miskin is like someone who is at a financial disadvantage. You have a miskin and then you have a faqir. There's a difference of opinion about what's the difference between the two. Some of them say faqir is someone who is not finding his basic sustenance, and a miskin is someone who finds the basic but not enough to be comfortable. Right? So that's what miskin means according to some. So how do I really understand these two hadiths, especially when there's another hadith that actually praises having money? That hadith is نِعْمَ الْمَالِ الصَّالِحِ لِلرَّجُلِ الصَّالِحِ. Blessed is the pleasant wealth for the righteous man. How do I understand and reconcile? When you have money, you have opportunity. And when you have opportunity, you have responsibility. And when you have a lot of responsibilities, there's a lot of things you could be questioned about on the Day of Judgment. When you don't have money, there's very little opportunity. And your role is to just be patient with circumstance. Because you might not find those doors to invest in stock markets or bonds. You might not find those opportunities to invest in a home or mortgage or have a restaurant or mash'arif or any other type of a supermarket. You don't have those opportunities. So your role is to be patient. But if you're someone who's a person of means, then your means might lead you to a lot of decisions. Allah knows if those decisions are good or bad. That's what you'll be held accountable for. So that's what it means. But the person who has a lot of wealth and actually discharges it with amana, that person, that wealth could be actually a means to very high status. There's a hadith that actually mentions this. ذَهَبَ أَهْلُ الدُّثُورِ بِالْأُجُورِ. The people of wealth and sustenance actually beat us to the high stations. They said to the Prophet ﷺ, they pray like we pray, they fast like we fast, and they do everything else, but Allah has given them money and we don't have that. So then the Prophet ﷺ gave them something to do. They gave them something else to do, and that was a certain nawafil and praying duha and so on and so forth. But they came back and complained again to the Prophet ﷺ. The Prophet ﷺ said, ذَلِكَ فَضْلُ اللَّهِ يُؤْتِيهِ مَنْ يَشَاءُ. That is Allah's fadl and His grace. He gives that to whomever He wills. So that's how we understand the hadith. The other hadith about Allahumma ahini miskinan wa amitni miskinan, the Prophet ﷺ is speaking about, see look, one of the things that comes with wealth and prosperity is sometimes it could easily corrupt a person's understandings and dealings with others. Sometimes it could lead to things like arrogance, wal-'iyadhu billah. You guys know the story of one of the greatest examples of takabbur in the Quran. Who is it? The one, he had a lot of wealth and affluence. Who is it? Fir'aun, political corruption, and he was a tyrant. This is a person who was noted in the Quran for his wealth and affluence. Who was it? Qarun, right? Qarun, exactly. Qarun was the staple example of someone who allowed his wealth and affluence to get to his head. When you have a lot of power and ability, sometimes it takes a whole lot of effort to make sure you still have good character. Right? So it complicates the worldview. It could make people with a level of arrogance or entitlement or sometimes mistrust of others and all kinds of other things. So that's the meaning behind the Prophet ﷺ was praying to Allah Azza wa Jal to be able to have a simple worldview. Sometimes you might find someone with a lot of money, yet they're very simple in their dealings with others. You find they're very, very down to earth, very giving, very loving. And that's a very special thing. That's a special person. Someone who's able to continue to be like that is a special person. That's how I think we should reconcile. Should you aspire for wealth? Yeah. Aspire for what is good for you. Sometimes you don't know if wealth is good for you. Sometimes Allah denies a person a lot of money because He knows that this person will be corrupted because of money. Think of this. Think of this. Not everyone could stay a good person with a lot of money. Sometimes it's the opposite. Allah knows every single person. Sometimes if the person was impoverished, it would lead them to lose their deen. Another person, if they have a lot of money, it would totally corrupt their character. That's why Allah Azza wa Jalla يوزع الأرزاق ويقسمها. He divides it with utmost wisdom and hikmah. Subhanah. That's why, be careful of this thing. There are people who don't have, who make a lot of promises to Allah. Oh Allah, if I have money, some people, okay, well, I have some money, I could give $100, maybe I can't give 10,000, right? I give $100. So they'll continue to have wishful thinking and they'll say, oh, one day when I become rich, I'm going to do a lot of good things for people. I'm going to give a lot of donations. One day when I become rich, I'll start doing a lot of good things for my parents, for my family, for the community, so on and so. Don't ever do that. Because Allah says about the munafiqeen, let me do what I can right now, in other words, and if I get money in the future, then I'll do that too. وَمِنْهُمْ مَنْ عَاهَدَ اللَّهِ لَإِنْ آتَانَا مِنْ فَضْلِهِ لَنَصَّدَّقَنَّ وَلَنَكُونَنَّ مِنَ الصَّالِحِينَ. There are people who made a promise to Allah, if you just give us money and prosperity, we're going to give charities. That's when we'll start giving charities. And we're going to be of the righteous. But when Allah gave them that, they became very stingy, they turned their backs. And hence Allah sealed upon their hearts with nifaq and hypocrisy. Don't ever, in other words, think that a little amount of giving or a little goodness in the way you manage your money, even if it's a small pool of money, is somehow less than a larger pool. This is a different discussion, but there's like a side note, a tangent right there. That's why the hadith says, رُبَّ دِرْهَمْ سَبَقَ أَلْفِ dirham. Perhaps 1 dirham beats 1,000. Allah.
The other thing that comes to mind is whether you're an employer, an employee, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala puts you in that situation, Allah is testing your trustworthiness. And I think that ties into what we were talking about, how we should view our finances through a spiritual lens. So obviously as an employer, you'll have a lot of opportunities to cheat people, to deprive them of money that's supposed to be owed to them, or to go down a path that may technically be something that most people or other business owners do, but as a Muslim, you hold yourself to higher standards. Or even on the flip side, if you're an employee, it's an amana, the time that you're being paid for, and how seriously you take that time, the time being spent actually working or wasting time. So if we can touch on that aspect of trustworthiness and how the way we deal with our wealth, whether it be earning or spending, how that ties into trustworthiness and ultimately our spiritual connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
Yeah, Jazakallah khair, Barakallah feek. This is a really important point in terms of ethics of this is exactly what ethics of Islamic finance means. Right? Trustworthiness, how does it play out in a business setting? You look at this hadith. The Prophet ﷺ said, يأتي على الناس زمان لا يبالي أحدهم من أين أخذ ماله أمن الحلال أم من الحرام. Prophet ﷺ tells us there's going to come a time when people will hardly care about where they get their earnings from. They won't care. Is the money they earned halal money or is it haram money? They won't care about this. And subhanAllah, this is a reality. When someone doesn't have taqwa and God consciousness, if they could cut corners, they will. If someone doesn't have a strong moral code, because sometimes you might find that someone doesn't believe in Allah. So the Muslim, his radi' and what holds him back is taqwa, God consciousness. But you might find someone who doesn't believe in Allah, who has an outstanding moral code. And that moral code holds that person back. So, but for me as a believer, that's where taqwa becomes very practical. Because it starts having to do with what I put my hands on in the workplace, what I give or don't give to people. That's why the Prophet ﷺ said in hadith, أعطوا الأجير أجره قبل أن يجف عرقه. Make sure you give someone who worked hard their deserved money before their sweat dries. You know, and then there's actually another hadith that says 3 people I will not speak to. لا يكلمهم الله يوم القيامة ولا يزكيهم ولهم عذاب أليم. There are 3 people who Allah Azza wa Jal will not give any regard on the Day of Judgment, and they'll actually be punished. One of these people is someone who has given a promise and then betrayed. رجل أعطى بي ثم غدر. Someone who's given a promise and then betrayed that promise. Another person is someone who, another example of that is someone who promised to give someone a sum of money for doing certain work and then he cheats him out of that. Wallahi, there's too many stories of this in our community. Wallahi, it's tragic when that ends up being the reality. When it comes to trustworthiness, you know, Akhi Muhammad, sometimes that might put you at a worldly disadvantage. That's where you need to like sort of balance between ideas of capitalism and opportunism and other things that might get you an extra buck at the expense of principles and values. When it comes to another hadith, that hadith says the following. It says, الْبَيِّعَانِ بِالْخِيَارِ مَا لَمْ يَفْتَرِقَا. That the buyer and seller have the option to rescind the sale while they're still together. Meaning, soon after you just finalize, you still have the option to rescind. Then it says the following. فَإِن صَدَقَا وَبَيَّنَا بُورِكَ لَهُمَا فِي بَيْعِهِمَا وَإِن كَذَبَا وَكَتَمَا مُحِقَتْ بَرَكَةُ بَيْعِهِمَا. Prophet ﷺ, he says, if they're honest and they expose everything that's relating to this, because some people, they'll be like, okay, that's stupid. That's dumb in business. Why would I show the flaws in what I'm trying to sell? Because if I do that, no one's going to take it off my hands. Especially if you're not dealing with brand new merchandise that has, factory warranties and all that other stuff. You know, you're dealing with used products, and especially like, for example, like a car or some other like mechanical objects. If you're selling them. If I start showing people, oh, this has a scratch here, and the transmission is bad, and this needs to be changed there, and all this stuff like that, and they'll be like, oh, I'm chasing away all the buyers. But the Prophet ﷺ says, if you actually do that, if you actually expose everything that's relating to your sale, you'll find barakah in it, blessings. And if you actually deceive, and sometimes, no offense to anyone who's a salesperson here. I don't know if there's any salespeople here, but sometimes part of the, the trick with being a salesperson is you need to, hype up the product, and you need to, make it look way better than it actually is. So the Prophet ﷺ says, وَإِن كَذَبَ وَكَتَمَا, if you end up lying just to sell the product, right? The hadith says, الْحَلِفُ منفقة للسلعة, alright, ممحقة للبركة. You lying a lot and say, Wallahi, this car is like that, and Wallahi, this item's like that, and Wallahi, kada wa kada wa kada. You might end up getting the sale, but in the process, you lose all the blessings in your wealth. Wallahu alam. So that's how I would address the subject of trustworthiness and how it plays out in a business setting. By the way, there's a scary hadith that tells us the following. Tells us in the end of times, amana will be lost. Trustworthiness will be lost from the lives of people. To the extent that يُقَالْ إِنَّ فِي بَنِي فُلَانٍ رَجُلٌ أَمِينٌ. People will be searching for trustworthy people. In the town of so-and-so, you'll find someone who's trustworthy. In this line of work, you're not going to find trustworthy people, but I know someone who'll deal with you good, so on and so forth. Wallahu a'lam. No.
So on the topic of trustworthiness, so we know the virtues of being trustworthy when it comes to your finances, and how there's barakah that you would pass along to your family and what you provide for them. But on the flip side, not being trustworthy in business, how does that impact one's life? Bringing home money to your family that might not come from halal means. How does that impact us in terms of a material dunya aspect as well as our spirituality and ultimately our akhirah?
Look, in terms of halal earnings, that should be at the top of the list of every person who is seeking Allah's pleasure. I should make that top priority. I want my money to be halal. I want to do everything I can to make sure I'm bringing home something pleasant to my family. And even if that means I don't have as much as I want, at least even if I have less, I'll have a lot more blessings in it. And in that regard, there's actually another hadith I forgot to mention. The Prophet ﷺ, one time, he saw, it was a pile of grains, subratu ta'am, as it says. And he found that when he touched the top of it, he found, so he said when he put his hand in this pile, just like for example overseas, how they would pack the kilos and of grains into bags and weigh them and so on and so forth. So when he put his hand in, he found at the very bottom there was balal. It was like moist, and it wasn't good quality. So then he told the man, "Ma hadha ya sahib al-ta'am? What is this? أَفَلَا جَعَلْتَهُ فَوْقَ حَتَّى يَرَاهُ النَّاسِ?" Why didn't you make this on the top? Right? You're trying to hide the things that aren't fresh. They're rotten at the bottom so people don't see it. They just see the nice, fresh looking fruits or whatever it might be at the top. And you put the rotten ones at the bottom. Why didn't you make that at the top so people could see what they're buying? Then the Prophet ﷺ said, "Man ghasha falaysa minna." Whoever deceives is not from us, right? What am I bringing home? What am I encouraging my spouse to earn? And what field am I choosing to work? These are all things to consider in that regard. Wallahu a'lam.
Switching gears, we have a couple of sisters who are asking, what are Muslim women's financial rights when she's married and makes her own money?
What are okay? That's a big time switch of gears. Yeah. What are Muslim women's financial rights when they also work? Right. So look, obviously, working, and being married is something that needs a delicate balance, right? Because there's a responsibility at home, and there's a responsibility, and then there's a right outside, right? So, as a general precedent, upon agreement between spouses, is it okay for a wife to work? The answer is, of course. Of course, this needs to be agreed upon, the details, in terms of, where, how long, this needs, if a shared decision. Always look at this. Don't make it about right and wrong, because if you do, your marriage is going to go down the drain. Make it about ittifaq, an agreement, and hopefully, there could be level-headed discussions. Of course, the problem is if you can't have a discussion. If one of the spouses is too set in their ways, unwilling to, give and take, and that's a problem in itself. It's going to manifest in this subject and 100 other subjects, right? Having that level of stubbornness in itself will also end a marriage, right? But as a principle, what are the financial rights? Our deen teaches us, of course, if a husband and wife agree that they can both work, then in that case, whatever the wife earns is her own property, of course, and it's not the property of her husband. And if she gives anything to the house, it's considered a form of charity. It's considered a sadaqah. She gets rewarded for that. If she wants to, she can't be compelled to, right? But on the other end, so here, there's a delicate balance between this, So what about then in terms of the husband's duties towards the home, right? So if you have a wife who wants to work full-time and earn a lot of money, and at the same time all of the financial responsibilities are on the husband, and he can't pay for the type of house that she wants, or he can't pay for the type of clothes that she expects, and so on and so forth. So this is where the delicate balance is. You can't find someone who comes out and say, well, you know what, I'm going to keep all my money to myself, but at the same time I expect you to go over and under and break your back to pay for something that is way beyond your means. No, it's a balance. If we really want to live at a certain level, then obviously there needs to be some share of responsibility. But as a principle, can someone force the woman to give up her own money? No, can't. Right? Allahu Alam.
The other aspect that I wanted to talk about was, somebody who, let's say in the past, wasn't as keen on where he earned his income from or how he was spending it.
Yeah.
If now he's, suddenly learning, either learning about this or, starting to take these matters seriously, should they despair in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala if, let's say, they can't hunt down the person that they, took money unlawfully from or didn't give them their due rights, or, let's say it was an employee who wasn't working as hard at a job that he knew he should have been working harder at?
Yeah. So look, that's a really good question. حقوق الغير هل تسقط بالتقادم? The rights of others, do they simply drop with passage of time? The answer to this is no. That's another thing you need to be very careful of when you're handling money. Make sure you take care of the rights of the others. Who are these others? Sometimes they're the fuqara, if we're talking about zakah, right? Sometimes they're the rights of Allah Azza wa Jal in terms of other financial acts of worship, right? Now, going deeper, if I know that I mismanaged my money, like say for example I haven't been giving zakah for the past 10 or 20 years of my life, does that mean I just start a new page right now and forget about the rest? No. I need to make up for all those years. How can I do that? By estimation. I need to figure out, and you know what, in our day and age it's a lot easier to do that, especially with bank accounts and everything documented and everything like that. I need to make sure that if I am someone who owes zakah, I give it for all of the years that passed in my life, to the best of my ability, right? To the best of my ability. If I owe other types of money to people, debts that are owed to others, that's something that I need to go over and under, trying to figure out how can I get this money to its rightful owner. You know what, if I can't find and I want to just be precautious, I could set aside that money until a day that this person walks in and asks me. And if I don't think that day is ever going to come, then perhaps I could choose to give it to charity as a means to seek forgiveness for some wrongdoing that I did in the past. If لا تأكلوا أموال الناس بالباطل, that's a big sin. Consuming the wealth of others wrongfully is a big sin. لا تأكلوا أموال الناس بالباطل. That's what the Quran says. Don't wrongfully consume the wealth of others. Wallahu alam. So if you are that person, do everything you can to make sure that you cleanse your wealth. That's part of why we give zakah. That's part of why we give charities, right? Is to cleanse the wealth. Wallahu alam.
On the subject of debt, so there's the person who's taking the debt and there's the person who's giving the loan or whatever it may be. So, in terms of being somebody who takes on debt, we know the virtue of paying that in a timely manner. But what would be the advice to somebody who's giving out the loan in terms of collecting the debt, and what does Islam say, and the Prophet ﷺ, what does he say about how that person should deal with the person who owes him the money?
Who owes him the money?
As the person who's giving out the loan.
So look, there's an ayah, that tells us, if you're someone who giving loans is actually an act of worship, in Islam, because you're not profiting. They're social welfare contracts. They're called uqud al-irfaq. Giving a loan to someone is a means of helping someone in need. Because if you were to make giving loans a business, that's what banks do. And that's riba, and that's haram. Of course, you can't profit off of a loan in any way. But if you're giving loans to help people, then of course there's going to be some element of sacrifice in that regard. And that's why Allah Azza wa Jalla, He says, وَإِن كَانَ ذُو عُسْرَةٍ فَنَظِرَةٌ إِلَى مَيْسَرَةٍ وَأَن تَصَدَّقُوا خَيْرٌ لَكُمْ إِن كُنتُمْ تَعْلَمُونَ. This is in Surah Al-Baqarah. Allah Azza wa Jalla, what is He saying in this ayah? He's saying, if the person you gave money to really doesn't have the money to pay it back, then give them time until they get that money, right? And then if they don't have that money, then forgiving debts is actually a matter of great virtue. And there's actually a beautiful hadith about this from one of the companions. One of the companions, his name is Abu Qatada. Abu Qatada, he was seeking the repayment of his loans, of his loan from this person. And this person began avoiding him. Classic textbook debtor behavior. He stopped appearing in the places where he used to appear. He started avoiding Abu Qatada. He disappeared. He disappeared. So Abu Qatada finally caught up to this guy. And he said to him, "Why have you been avoiding me?" So he said, "Because I owe you money and I don't have the money to repay you." So then he said to him, "Abshir, فإني سمعت رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم يقول من سره أن ينجيه الله من كرب يوم القيامة فَلْيُنَفِّسْ عَنْ مُعْسِرٍ أَوْ يَضَعْ عَنْهُ." Prophet ﷺ said, whoever wants to be saved from the calamities of the Day of Judgment, then let him either relieve the person of part of the debt or completely forgive it. Right? That's an act of worship. That's ethics of Islamic. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about ethics of Islamic finance. Forgiving debts. Now on the other side though, this is a very scary thing. On the other side, so that's if you're the creditor. What if you're the debtor? What if you owe the money? Now you need to be very careful. Because the Prophet ﷺ says in the hadith, يُغْفَرْ لِلشَّهِيدِ كُلُّ ذَنْبٍ إِلَّا الدَّيْنِ. Prophet ﷺ says, every sin will be forgiven for the true martyr, except debt. There's another hadith that says, الْإِنسَانُ مَرْهُونٌ بِدَيْنِهِ حَتَّى يُقْضَى عَنْهُ. The person will be held in his qabr from experiencing the na'im of Jannah until he pays back his debts. Right? The scary thing about debts is, if someone doesn't pay it back, and they actually have the money to pay it back, this is considered matl. Matl is one of the kaba'ir. Matlul ghani dhulmun. What does matl mean? It is for someone to begin imatil. Right? He begins to, he's not really being, oh, should I pay him back? Should I not pay him back? Oh, I'll pay you back next week. No, I'll pay you next month. Oh, give me more time. Then when the date comes, oh, I need more 6 months. If he's doing this on purpose, he actually is doing one of the kaba'ir. If he continues to delay the repayment of debts, he's doing one of the major sins. That's a scary thing. Matlul ghani dhulm. من أخذ أموال الناس يريد أداءها أدى الله عنه. Whoever takes the money of people with the intention of paying it back, Allah will help him pay it back. Whoever takes it with the intention of consuming it, وَمَنْ أَخَذَهَا يُرِيدُ إِتْلَافَهَا أَتْلَفَهُ اللَّهُ. Allah will ruin that person. وَالْعِيَاذُ بِاللَّهِ.
Jazakallah khair. So there's a lot of questions coming in, obviously with a topic such as finance, and there's a lot of questions coming in regarding mortgages, regarding taking out loans for businesses, student loans for law school, medical school, dental school. So with these, I mean, it's not a specific question, it's just one of the generic. So is there a specific guideline they can go by when dealing with these hot topics?
We could keep that in a separate discussion. Yes. This one's just ethical. This is about the spiritual side of it. The ahkam side of it, we'll have another gathering about that. We'll do an FAQ, frequently asked questions about Islamic finance. This one is to make me think a little bit more critically. How am I spending the dollar I have? Am I a slave to this dollar? Am I a slave to this dollar? Am I dealing with it in a way, am I earning it in a way that's pleasing to Allah Azza wa Jal? I did want to just finish by saying a few things. When it comes to ethics of Islamic finance, every person should keep in mind the following. I should never allow myself to mix priorities. I should never allow myself to sacrifice my principles and values for any worldly gain. Sometimes people sacrifice their kids and their families for work. And that's an awful decision to make. So many parents have lost their kids because they chose to live like workaholics for their whole lives. That's a devastating thing. When it comes to ethics of Islamic finance, another thing that comes to mind is the way I choose to work in a business setting. I have a shop that sells this and someone else has the same type of shop. What am I doing? Am I stealing my brother's business? I need to be careful from this. Am I stealing other people's business when the Prophet ﷺ says, لا يبع بعضكم على بيع بعض? Make sure you don't sell upon the sale of your brother. Don't do that because that's unethical. It's unethical to try to cheat people out of their money for personal gain, cutting corners, like we said. You know, when we're talking about ethics of Islamic finance, how am I dealing with my partners? There's 1,000,001 stories. Unfortunately, these mistakes keep on happening over and over again. 1,000,001 stories of partners, their relationships souring because of awful character, deception, cheating, opportunism, and on and on. So many other things. Partnership actually shows the level of iman in the heart of a person. And that's why there was one of the companions, this is what I'm going to finish with, I know it's time for Isha. There was one of the companions, he was the partner of the Prophet ﷺ. Any of you guys know his name? I mentioned it sometimes before in some khutbah and classes. Who was the partner of the Prophet ﷺ in Jahiliyyah? He was Sahabi. His name was As-Sa'ib, Ibn Abi Sa'ib. One time he walked in, and the people were praising him. And the Prophet ﷺ said to them, أَنَا أَعْلَمُكُمْ بِهِ. I'm the one who knows him best, because he was his partner in Jahiliyyah. Before Islam, the Prophet ﷺ was a partner for As-Sa'ib ibn Abi Sa'ib. So he said, نَعَمْ كُنْتَ شَرِيكِ فَنِعْمَ الشَّرِيكُ كُنْتَ لَا تُدَارِ وَلَا تُمَارِ. He began praising the Prophet ﷺ. You were the best partner. You were not someone who was deceptive. You were not disingenuous. You were not a liar. Partnerships actually tubriz ma'adin al-rijal. It actually shows who the people are on the inside. And wallahu alam, as you could see, there's a lot to address, and that's why we put part 1. We need to have a part 2. Inshallah, we'll continue to discuss this so that we could give a new dimension of worship. It's one thing to talk about spirituality. It's another thing to speak about spirituality through something that's very real in our lives. The money that's in our pockets right now. I ask Allah Azza wa Jal to give us understanding and wisdom. Jazakumullah khair for attending. Jazakallah khair Akhi Muhammad for discussing it with me. And inshallah, I guess we'll continue next time. جزاك الله خير مولانا. ماشي سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد ان لا اله الا انت نستغفرك ونتوب اليك. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. العصر ان الانسان لفي خسر الا الذين امنوا الصالحات وصدقوا وتواصوا بالصبر. By the way, next time we noticed that in the beginning the attendance was a little light, so it seems like Maghrib is too early now. So next time we'll start with Isha inshallah. So we're going to move, we're going to update the time for the Friday forum from next time to Salat al-Isha. And Isha is going to gradually keep on going down. So next time I think it's 8:10. And then the week after that it'll be less than 7. And it'll get down to 7:30. It's 8:25 next week? Okay, so next time we'll keep it at 7:30. And then the time after that we'll change it inshallah. So next time 7:30 and then the time after that we'll change it. Jazakumullah khair. Assalamu alaikum.